The case out of OO is very simple. Bosnia is at a state of fragile stability. Any kind of radical departure from that would be horrific and lead to the potential of destabilization, and that is the most important impact in this debate. Before that, though, I just want to note one kind of tension I found in the opening government case, which is, if these policies are unnecessary, why on earth would the High Representative actually be passing them in the first place? Like, presumably this person is also aware that these things are not issues to the same extent, and if that's true, and if these things are being healed upon naturally, presumably the High Representative would not want to infringe upon that process. So either they need to accept that it's kind of unstable or not. Like, the framing there doesn't make much sense, at least in terms of what we think. The second thing they say is, it's actually going to be fine because, there's an ethnic majority of Bosniaks, and that's decent, which is true writ large in Bosnia. It's about 50% Bosniak. But, crucially, it's ethnically concentrated, right? So there are about 30% of Serbians who all live in the same part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, namely Republika Srpska, and those are the ones who can radicalize among themselves. So even if writ large it is, fine and a majority is something that we want, at least in specific places it's actually going to be far worse. Alright. The first bit of the OO case is going to be why these individuals make good decisions and only intervene when absolutely necessary. The first point is that this person is likely to be relatively neutral. So the structure of Bosnia and Herzegovina as it exists is that there is, a Croat Bosniak federation and also Republika Srpska where Serbians dominate. And this is quite intuitive because, that is how you would set up a peace agreement within these places in the Dayton Agreement. You would try and give concessions to both sides. And crucially, the person selecting this individual is the Security Council, which is relatively balanced because both the US and Russia have vetoes on this individual, and that's important because it means that, for example, the US can veto anyone who's really pro-Serb, and Russia can veto anyone who's really pro-Bosniak, and so you get some degree of neutrality that exists because obviously US and Russia have historical ties with their respective groups that we're talking about. So given that the individual chosen is probably quite balanced. But the second point is, the person who is like a lifetime diplomat, right? They've probably risen through the ranks of the UN. They are obviously aware of how much of a tinderbox Bosnia and Herzegovina is. They will probably only be willing to make decisions if they think that is in the best interest of that kind of region overall, and so probably only act in the worst kind of situation. They have a lifetime of this sort of experience. And the last thing I would note here is they probably have neutral advisors who can help them out and kind of be lobbied by both sides to try and have the most neutral policies. So they probably make good decisions, but also crucially, they're probably seen as quite legitimate as well by individuals in the country. Because first of all, the Dayton Agreement is literally the founding constitution of this particular country. It has existed now for a process of 30 years. It is something that people are obviously incredibly used to and people generally like because it gives all groups within that country a relative degree of autonomy. So therefore, people probably support the agreement in and of itself. But also the UN is probably the most neutral actor to decide this in these sorts of situations, rather than maybe the US acting individually within Bosnia and Herzegovina in general. Probably it's better for these people to decide, the UN to decide it in general. And the last thing I would note is that obviously the consequences have been that Bosnia and Herzegovina is at least relatively stable in the period since the Dayton Agreement has been signed, insofar as there's been no war, and if you buy the opening government logic, presumably people want to avoid that, and so won't try and upset the apple cart. What are the impacts here? I think what this shows is that this individual is both seen as legitimate, but also will only intervene in the most extreme cases of the kind of denial and so on that they talk about, which is obviously the worst kind of things because that is massively inflammatory towards the Bosniaks who live in this particular country. But also I would note it means that each individual federation is not going to pass the most inflammatory laws because they know that it will be rejected by the High Representative. And the comparative when this position doesn't exist, you have much more of a free hand to engage in policies that you think are far more inflammatory. Before I continue and talk about why the comparative is far worse, yes?
Can you please explain to me why specifically within these regions people are unlikely to actually cooperate with one another, create policies that better themselves?
Yeah. The reason is kind of quite obvious. They fought a war against each other in living memory, and they probably still have massive degrees of ethnic tensions to an extent that still exists because, if genocide against your group happened 30 years ago, it's probably not going to lead you to want to cooperate too much. All right. On the comparative, what happens when you dissolve this position? And the first thing I would note here is that insofar as this person comes in at the very highest level and only rejects the highest most policies, essentially what this person is like a final act or final say over laws that get passed, which now goes away. And we say that the process of replacement, or at least how you determine laws or what gets passed now, is far, far worse. Because insofar as Bosnia and Herzegovina is very diverse and decentralized in the way that we say, that means that you can then pass the sorts of policies that we're talking about. You can then even pass, if you're Republika Srpska, something that says that actually, we didn't commit genocide, or those sorts of laws. And I think it's very obvious the reason why politicians would engage in this sort of thing. It is much easier to rely on ethnic tensions and rile them up and stroke them up than engage in things like, economic policy or economic progress, because those things are far harder to do, they're far more uncertain. It's much easier for you to argue based on your ethnically homogenous group. But also, secondly and importantly, even if the individual politicians at the top are not doing this, it's very hard to retain centralized control over individuals, right? Because you can do things like on a low level, individuals starting off protests or making inflammatory decisions, and at that stage the leader, even if the leader has good anti-war incentives, doesn't have much control over what's going on the ground, and so things get riled up from the bottom up. And I think then, what happens is that insofar as these long-term tensions still exist to an extent, any kind of disruption to the status quo as it exists right now is likely to lead to massive degrees of tension. There's massive degrees of infighting about what the actual replacement process even ends up being in the first place, and how laws are actually determined on their side of the house. Now, the crucial bit here is the following, because opposition teams will say, aha, but there's the same sort of problem in the sense that, when this person passes laws, they're also seen as legitimate, and that also causes massive degrees of instability. But I think the first bit of my case already shows that this individual is seen as far more legitimate, but also I would note this is a far more radical departure from the status quo. Insofar as this is a high representative that's existed since the foundation of the country, it's now something that people who have adapted to, have got used to, and see it as relatively normal. When you remove this individual, when you remove this person who is seen as a safety net for Bosniaks, for example, or for the Serbs themselves, because he's a relatively neutral individual, you get rid of that safety net, you now leave a massive vacuum, and it's unclear how it gets filled, and that's when you get the sorts of massive inflation of tensions that occur. So given that then, the end point here is that tensions will probably rise to a significant extent on their side of the house when they decide how you replace a particular individual, or what you have, or even the power vacuum that exists. Even psychologically, right, when people feel as if there's a chance they might get, attacked to some extent, they'll probably lash out in the worst ways possible. I think it is by far the most important impact in the debate, because it is a prerequisite to the country having the sort of growth and development that opening government won. Very proud to oppose.
So firstly, I'm going to take out the OG case, then I'll explain why Anikit's case wins this debate. On the OG case, in DPN they had this new thing about a principle coming up. The first thing I'd like to note here is that we already explained why the High Representative is likely to only act in dire situations. This means that the High Representative is not replacing the government in a way that would be a blatant violation of sovereignty, but it's more like oversight. So if you try to do something really bad or really dangerous to the population, then it steps in. So it's the same violation of the principle of sovereignty in the same way that something like a Governor General or a Senate is, which most countries have. Secondly, people literally consented to this supposed violation of their sovereignty because the Dayton Agreement that ended the war in Bosnia was something that a lot of people were in favor of, that like the UN led and lots of people liked because it meant that it ended the war that was killing people and their families, meaning that this consent largely exists. On OO's main case, so their first case is that it's unnecessary because people currently get along. Their first mechanism here is that there's an ethnic majority of Bosniaks here. This is not true. The country is about 50% Bosniak, which is not enough of a majority to shut everybody else up. The rest of the country is composed of Serbs and Croats in largely ethnically, like they're centered in largely ethnically cohesive areas, which means that any division along ethnic lines has sizable support and a sizable voice. Then they say that people just naturally don't want to piss others off. The first thing I'd like to note is that this contradicts their second point, where the reason the High Representative had to ban denying genocide in the first place was obviously that people were doing it. This is conceded by their second point when they say people are going to be angry that they cannot deny genocide anymore, meaning that people are obviously doing it. Secondly, people specifically want to act and speak in favor of their ethnic group in Bosnia, and there are two reasons for this. Firstly, that many people have lived through these wars because they happened only about 20 years ago in the 90s, so many people still think that their side is unjustly blamed or was unfairly oppressed, and they want to speak out about that, which is why there's still a problem. But secondly, the structure of the government in this country leads to a lot of ethnic division. This is because people vote for politicians who act in their interests because you have specific ethnic parties that rotate power sharing in the government, where these politicians help you and they don't help others, which means that the structure of politics predisposes people to not find common ground, but rally along ethnic lines. The second point that opening government talks about is how there is an inflammation of tensions. The first mech here is that they're unelected. Firstly, this is not necessarily something that is going to make people angry, and they never recognize why this is true. For instance, lots of people in the government who make decisions are unelected, like many ministers in countries are appointed, or the central bank is unelected, and many of the decisions that they make are hugely impactful to how people live. This is because people recognize that some people have the capacity for impartial oversight or informed decisions that will benefit your country irrespective of whether or not you have elected them. Democracy is not a good in and of itself. Some people can recognize that democracy leads to partisanship in harmful ways, especially in very ethnically divided states like Bosnia, which is why many people support the High Representative. Secondly, though, we flip this point by explaining how the High Representative is actually perceived as more reputable. This is because in every democratic decision in Bosnia, there's going to be a significant portion of the country that did not directly vote for the leader, given the power rotating structure in the government, given the ethnic parties there, which means that any decision that is made by a democratically elected official is necessarily going to alienate a specific portion of the country. The reason the High Representative is better is because people more uniformly support the UN and the Dayton Agreement. It literally ended the war in your country. The UN helped lift the siege of Sarajevo and made it so that your family didn't keep having to die. And so you respect this system more than you respect the Serbian guy in power when you were a Bosniak. Then they say that people are going to get angry because there are going to be controversial laws. Firstly, this is a reason why the High Representative is going to use its power only in dire situations, because they don't want to undermine its legitimacy by acting really randomly in a lot of ways, right? So they respond that, oh, but then you can reactivate UN support only when it's necessary. However, it tends to be necessary in unexpected situations, such as when a Milosevic supporter pops up out of nowhere and tries to run for office. You can't take forever to re-implement the UN in these cases. The High Representative just has to be there to act, because of course it's always worse when you act afterwards. Before I talk about our case, I'll take closing.
Considering the fact that nationalism and the actual start of these tensions started in Serbia, why is this necessary in Bosnia and Herzegovina only? Why is it not applicable to other countries in the Yugoslav region as well?
That is completely outside of the debate. We're just talking about maintaining this structure in Bosnia. Like, if it's good in Bosnia, then the POI is completely irrelevant. So on our case then, Our case proves that opening government's entire case is uncomparative. Because if opening government's main case is that there's going to be backlash towards the High Representative for whatever reason, their case cannot be that in the absence of the High Representative, nobody is ever going to pass a law that makes people angry. We think that laws are going to have backlash on either side of the House, but it's going to be far worse on their side for two reasons. Firstly, while the High Representative is disconnected as opening government concedes, we think this is a good thing. On the other hand, they have politicians who are old men who have lived through the conflict in their lives, who have grown up in a country that is shaped by ethnic tensions, and so they are more likely to pass inflammatory laws than a High Representative who comes from Austria who has never gone through the same thing. Secondly, the political system is set up in a way that makes you favor your ethnic group, as I've already explained. So where you give your own ethnic group favors, where they vote for you in return, where the country is divided into regions, where a certain region of the country is a Serbian majority, that means that politicians in these areas are obviously predisposed to favor the majority in that area and to undermine any minorities that exist. This means that people are going to make decisions that make people angry anyways. So a Serbian nationalist is going to run and win office and then turn around and discriminate against the Bosniaks. Genocide denial, if not banned, is also going to make people very angry if they feel like they've lived through a genocide. So their entire case is uncomparative. But the weighing here then is twofold. Firstly, that one law implemented by the High Representative, or one law that is overturned to protect people, is probably going to cause some amount of backlash and make people angry right now in our worst case. The problem is, on their side, something like a constitutional amendment that entrenches discrimination against an ethnic group is going to last forever. It's going to impact everyone, and you won't be able to repeal it with the current structure of government that leads to a lot of gridlock. This means the High Representative is absolutely necessary to prevent things like permanent discrimination or something messing up the fragile peace in Bosnia. The second point of weighing then is that if anger exists anyways, at least this mechanism is a form of damage control. So given there's a fragile peace that everybody wants to maintain, and there are constant incentives given the structure of politics in this country that makes people continually want to favor their own ethnic group, people are always going to be inflammatory. So what we need is a form of risk aversion in the form of the High Representative to allow that High Representative to step in, not in all cases, but in cases where stepping in is absolutely necessary to prevent people from disrupting that peace. On that basis, I'm very proud to oppose.
Okay, I can begin? Okay. All negation will be integrated. Let's go. So, first of all, just so that we don't forget this, Bosnia has 3 governors. It's pretty much 3 countries in one. That's number one thing, right? So already OG, a lot of their analysis by this is out, right? OO was really good at telling you why this representative was, is gonna be good, la la la. What we're going to do is actually engage in the comparative, actually tell you what specifically the alternative on Gov will look like and why exactly the harm will happen. We're gonna flesh it out. We're gonna have 2 points. Let's start with the first one. Not everyone actually wants Bosnia. Bosnia was not the intimate choice of people who were fighting in a war. It's not like they were like, yay, let's create this dysfunctional state of 3 ethnicities living together, where you literally have 3 presidents. You have 3 presidents who call the shots. This makes Bosnia, I want you to imagine and realize how inefficient the decision-making process actually is, how problematic this is. When government benches talk about anger, when they talk about people who are inflamed, who feel patronized by the West, etc., these people do not feel this anger just because there's the high representative. These are the people who actively want to pursue the dissolution of Bosnia. So this is something that they have to contend with, right? Like they cannot just say, we're going to, make everyone happy by removing this one person, because people who are not happy with this one person are people who are not happy with Bosnia. Let's analyze who is not happy with Bosnia. A big part of Bosnian politics and Bosnian society are non-state actors, and I will call them what they are, different paramilitary groups who fought in the war. This is a big trick, right? It was not official armies of countries. No. It was paramilitary groups that have, pretty obvious connections, but no official connections. And these are now the biggest political players, especially in the radical parts of Bosnian society. Let's characterize them. 1, they are by ideology ultra-nationalist. What does that mean? That means that their priorities are never going to be, soft power increases, slightly higher GDP growth, etc., etc. It's far more important for them to, achieve Lebensraum for their own people, to, make the nation survive, to keep the culture and tradition protected. Because if their intentions and incentives would be otherwise, the whole war would not have happened, because they would just decide to speed run the European Union. They did not do that because this is not what they actually wanted. Second of all, these organizations are quite patriarchal, which means that a lot of power is held by old guys who 30 years ago were commanders who are actually fighting in this war. Third of all, a lot of these areas are extremely fucking poor, which means that people there have very little to gain from, abstract stuff as GDP growth. This is not something that motivates people politically. Like no one is like, we have now 0.5% larger GDP growth. This is not something that, will factor into their planning. But what does factor into their planning is, because a lot of this is primary sector economy, is natural riches. How much land do you have? How much land did the Serbs steal from you? Where would you actually be able to live a better life, produce more food, etc., etc. And this is why the biggest things motivating them are, number 1, revenge, and number 2, the size of the nation, the land their ethnicity actually controls. Because why did the wars happen? The wars happened because in Yugoslavia we were all friends, living together, mixed up. After it broke apart, everyone, except Slovenia, we were like kind of doing our own thing, everyone else wanted to get as much of their land as possible, which is why you do ethnic cleansing. Okay, government bench had this assumption of what time will solve. Look, the reason why time works differently in Bosnia, haha, trains are late, but time works differently because 1, these communities are fully separated. Go to Mostar. Mostar, beautiful town, Croatians and Bosniaks live in this town. Literally a river separates them totally. There is no mingling of the communities. There is no, now with times we're all friends. Even schools, this is a sad example, but they have the system of 2 schools under 1 roof. This means that even when you have the same fucking building, when you're too poor to build 2 buildings for 2 special ethnicities, you make sure they have separate entrances. They have separate times they go to class. The time stuff doesn't happen. What does this mean? This means that now you have Milorad Dodik, leader of Serbia, like in the Republika Srpska, who literally for the past year has been trying to achieve Republika Srpska getting their own fucking army. What does this mean? That they get their own fucking army? This means Bosnia falls apart, the constitution can no longer be upheld, because this is how they can achieve the long-term goal and they can secede. A similar thing, how this tension works. Kosovo is also a good example. 2 days ago, Kosovo tried to do some retaliatory diplomatic measures against Serbia. The Serbs in Kosovo responded, the paramilitary groups. They put up barricades, they started shooting. So now let's bring in the Delta here. Someone needs to hold this country together. Someone needs to A, prevent these radical steps by physically preventing people to gain power in terms of political office, etc., so that the people who do not want Bosnia to fall apart can be in power and control money, control resources, etc. Now the question is, on our side of the house, for the past 30 years, this has been done successfully by the UN representatives. What happens on their side of the house? Do the three presidents uphold the position of power? This is very unlikely. And what is the problem? When you have inefficiency of selecting, inefficiency of making decisions, you will not be able to ban people from participating. You will not be able to pass decisions. No, thank you. Nothing good will happen of that. By the way, CG is totally out here because their main point is Russia interest, la la la. This has not been a problem for the past 30 years. Not sure why their analysis is actually empirically true. Why this would now become a problem? Before I continue, OJ, quick.
Neither option gives us any reasons as to why people demonize, oppress, and trap by these laws will actually adhere to them or enforce them.
But Sidi, it's not that you like the laws. It's like when you have a country, if you want to organize an army, you need to be able to control the tax revenues. The tax revenues are controlled the person in power. The person in power must adhere to constitution. Like, you cannot just walk in, right? And they cannot do that because the high representative is like, fuck you, you work against the constitutional order, you cannot work. But second point here is also, now let's analyze how the people will understand this move by the UN. The last time the UN was in Bosnia and moved out, literal genocide happened. Why? Because people on the ground are not moved by, we are going to have soft power, sanctions, la la la. They understand hard power. Serbia literally had to be bombed several times in order to stop their warmongering actions. So how will Serbian Republika Srpska forces, but not only in Bosnia, also in Kosovo, how will they understand this move? They will explain it to themselves by only possible explanation, which is that the world has lost the political capital and interest to do safekeeping and to keep together the constitution of Dayton. And what is the one possible reaction? That all the attempts already in place, which are now, bumped down by these representatives, that all these attempts are now going to have regained political capital, regain push, and maybe, because now you seize the opportunity, regain support by state actors such as Serbia, who currently is very low-key about the whole situation because they're afraid of the fucking West, right? Because of those reasons, CO.
Okay, I think we need to give some very clear context into what is happening in the Balkans, how people in the Balkans view each other, and how people in the Balkans are currently organizing their states, right? Let's first look at Bosnia, what is happening there, and why the representative is absolutely necessary. We tell you that in Bosnia, because you have a power sharing agreement, because you have 3 different ethnic groups that all have their own governments and their own presidents, you get a significant decrease of people in Bosnia, parliaments in Bosnia being able to pass laws or being able to accept them. This looks like Dodik wanting to have his own army, wanting to fund his own army from the taxes that Republika Srpska collects. And the only one who is able to stop him is the national representative. That is very important because not the Bosnian government nor the Croatian government can actually stop him from doing that. You need an outside power to step in when such people want to make actions that are, objectively bad for the stability of Balkans. We think that with that, we show you why 1, this national representative is absolutely necessary, and 2, how in the status quo you have these ethnic tensions. You have like every situation, every law that is passed in Bosnia and Herzegovina is dire, right? Every decision that you make is going to anger certain ethnic groups. This is why you absolutely need a national representative for them to at least have some semblance of legitimacy, right? Secondly, Kosovo, right? We tell you that Kosovo still has peacekeepers on the ground, and that secondly, that there are literal barricades on the border of Serbia that were put up on Monday. We are not joking. The Balkan is in distress. Stability in the Balkans is already impacted to a large degree, and just because some teams come from Iona, they cannot choose to ignore this reality of the people living in the Balkans, right? We tell you that the situation is not stable. We tell you that ethnic tensions are running as high as they can, and we cannot afford to put militias into the mix. We cannot afford to give Dodik, that sense of hope that maybe now the UN is moving out and he will finally get to stab some people because he, would like to do that. We think that this is something that exclusively comes from the CO. What we want to also tell you is just this is a recent war. Veterans from this war are running for parliament. War criminals can run for parliament. The only person that can regulate voting laws and who can run for parliament is the national representative, right? But, okay, and then OO tells you that they can do this, right? Mattia exclusively brings you the mechanism as to why this is bad, right? Mattia is the only one that has any impact in this debate, because what does he tell you, right? We tell you that in the status quo, we can physically prevent problematic people from running to be in the parliament, right? You can veto these people. What we tell you is that when you don't have that entity who has the power to do this, you get hard power in the parliament, right? We tell you that when those people have access to creating policies, when those people have access to, changing how the government works, what does that look like? That looks like money from taxes going to funding tanks. That looks like people, taking over commands of the armies. That is hugely problematic because we have shown you that there are people within Bosnia and Herzegovina who want conflict, who want to take over other parts of Bosnia because, Republika Srpska think that they are entitled to more space than they have. They think that this space was stolen from them by the Bosniaks. We tell you this is absolutely necessary because then those people get unprecedented power. We tell you that any sort of we're going to have government cohesion, one doesn't work, but 2, even if it did work, soft power doesn't work on these people, right? Those people won't respond to sanctions. Those people won't respond to the government giving them a slap on the wrist. The only way we can prevent from militias to getting into power is to prevent them from holding any power in the first place. That means they cannot get into the parliament, because with that you give them the power to ignore sanctions. With that you give them, that legitimacy that now, you have a war criminal in the parliament who is directly supporting you and funding you. But before that,
The radical revenge-motivated leadership framed by Steele clearly will adhere to laws, but will respond with violent paramilitary or insurgent groups to free themselves from such an oppressive, demonizing system.
Okay, but this is not happening in the status quo. We have the national representative in the status quo, and the situation is as fine as it can be. We are telling you that you are losing this hard power that this person has if you are, if you do that, right? We tell you that you need this person because they are uninvolved, because they are removed from the situation, and because they are, as neutral as they can get. They have backing from the West, they have backing from Russia. We tell you that is the only person that has sway over paramilitias because they have the power to prevent them from getting into power in the first place. We don't think that this radicalism happens, otherwise Bosnia wouldn't exist in the status quo in the first place, right? Government has no power to regulate. They cannot, they won't be able to even accept laws because those nations will not cooperate. Even if you mechanize that they are going to be rotating, that they are going to be rotating power and that this will somehow work, we don't see the mechanism behind it, and we don't see why one government wouldn't just undo what the previous government has done already. We don't know why they get any efficacy on their side for the good of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But also, we tell you that we don't know why all of this discord that we are the only ones to characterize in this debate will now suddenly dissolve and we will all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. We tell you that the young generations don't think like that. We tell you that the young people are segregated within the cities that they live in. We tell you that they get different educations and they get educations from different places. This is not something that they can just choose to ignore and tell us, but they're going to see GDP growth. They're not going to see GDP growth because GDP growth does not affect them directly. What does affect them directly is being able to, reclaim a city for their nationality. You have to understand that nationalities within the Balkans, and especially within Bosnia, are still very important because you vote along ethnic lines, right? But in our case, you still can vote against ethnic lines. You cannot vote for extremists. On their side, we're not sure why this extremism won't happen. We tell you that Mattia is the only one that engages in the comparative of this debate. We take over because we tell you that the side of government is a side of discord, is a side of tensions. So.